Last Dance, Jordan and the Bulls. Let's dig a little deeper. Mitch Lawrence, longtime NBA writer, SiriusXM NBA radio, covered it all, seen it all, including plenty of the 90s and the Jordan Bulls. Let's bring him in now on the Boardwalk Honda hotline and get some reaction to what we saw last night. Now, I'm going to start with this, Mitch.
All right, Mike, how you doing?
I'm doing great, man.
Good.
We got to see some good stuff last night. But I do want to start with this. My producer asked me what I took from it. And I didn't really I didn't answer it in a way of what I took from the documentary. I take as competitive as Jordan was as a player. How is he such a donkey as an executive? Like, where did that competitive nature go in this role?
You know what? I'm sitting there and I tweeted, out, and this has been a kind of a theme I've had over the years. Like, as much as they destroyed Jerry Krause, who's like the easiest target ever, and he shouldn't be. But Michael was one of these guys. He had no use for Jerry Krause in a lot of ways. Like somebody like Jerry Krause running the Hornets these days.
Absolutely. Exactly what you said. I'm laughing because I'm like, how is Jordan so, like, to me, the difference when you have this whole frivolous LeBron versus Jordan conversation, I don't know who's a better player. I really don't. One guy plays in this era, that guy played in that era. Right. If you're a Jordan guy or a LeBron guy, so be it. But the difference to me is the competitiveness, the fact that you just couldn't top that. He never lost. He refused to lose. But he's refusing to lose constantly. He doesn't refuse to lose as an owner. It's just bizarre to me.
Well, one thing I will say about, and this is just, me, I've been watching the NBA for a long time. People, you talk about Jordan versus LeBron. What a lot of people don't realize, and it's funny, when they were drafted, when they talked about that draft last night, when Michael went to the Bulls, and they had Walt Frazier, who I've known a long time, and he had that clip about, he's not going to be able to lead a team to a championship. Remember that?
Yep.
And a lot of people took off on that on Twitter and went crazy. You have to remember the times. Before Michael Jordan came along, wing players did not lead their teams to NBA championships. What Clyde was saying, what Walt Frazier was saying, was basically the way people thought the game was. People thought you had to win. You needed a dominant big man first. You needed a Wilt. You needed a Bill Russell. Let's start with him, or a George Mikan. And then up through the 60s, you needed these dominant bigs. And when, Walt played, he had a dominant big for a while in Willis Reed. He wasn't a, huge guy. He was 6'9", but he was an MVP of the regular season when they won the title in 69-70. He was the MVP of the finals, MVP of the All-Star game. That's what Walt's talking about, because at that time, guys like Michael Jordan, 6'6" wing players, didn't lead their teams to championships.
Right.
That's the difference. And that's why Jordan was such an outlier. That's why Jordan was such a pioneer, because now you can have wing players who do win you championships, or you can lead you championships. Like, LeBron James is basically a bigger, I'm not going to tell you he's a classic wing, but he's a 6'9" power. Guys like that, guys like Steph Curry, those guys, you didn't win before championships. You needed to have dominant big men. So that kind of gets lost in the translation. They should have done a little bit better with that. Plus, I'll tell you what, nobody skated more than Jerry Reinsdorf did, the owner, last night. Jerry Krause is being blamed left and right. And I'm not I dealt with Jerry Krause when he was the GM, and he was difficult to deal with because, he didn't want to talk to the media and didn't want to share anything. Okay, fine. But for people to think that Jerry Krause broke up the Bulls, that's ridiculous. Jerry Krause basically wanted to do what he did, and he got the okay from the owner.
Right.
Jerry Reinsdorf is the guy. He could have said, listen, Jerry, going into that last year, you know what? We're going to keep everybody around for a couple more years, and I'm going to pay the freight. He didn't do that.
Exactly.
We allowed Jerry Krause to dismantle the team, but it's up to Jerry Reinsdorf, the owner. There's no GM who determines what happens to a team. The owner decides when the dynasty is going to continue or if it's over, because he's the one who pays the freight and signs the checks. But I'll tell you what, Jerry Krause last night, this was predictable. He was going to get a beating, and he did.
Mitch Lawrence with us here looking back at the doc. Now, at that time, you had the Celtics, you had the Lakers, but, it was still like, they were fighting to get some television time, and it was just kind of turning over there. Where was the league kind of when Jordan came in? Because that was kind of right after those Showtime Lakers played the Celtics, in the late 70s and 80s, and you had the Sixers there in 83, and then Jordan comes into the league. So at that point, then what happens?
Well, the league's in bad shape still because there's still – even though Magic and Larry are turning it around, you got to remember this was not that long after the NBA is it's heavily black. There's a lot of drugs in the league. You heard the Michael Jordan anecdote about the cocaine traveling Bulls and what happened when he walked into, when he tried to find teammates where he was in Peoria or whatever for a preseason game, and there were guys in there with drugs and stuff, and he got the hell out because he said if he could, this was going to be him who was going to get nailed if anything happened. That's the way the NBA was. This was still, they were fighting an image problem, and although Magic and Larry were starting to take over, and you could see the beginnings of this league is going to go to a different place. As Jerry Reinsdorf said, or somebody said from the Bulls, when Michael came in, the Bulls were getting outdrawn at home by an indoor soccer league team. That's just the amazing thing. The Bulls are a nowhere franchise, and all of a sudden, here comes Michael Jordan, who in the first couple of weeks, if it took even that, he shows everybody, wow, he's going to be a big-time player for us, and all of a sudden they start selling tickets like nobody's business, and he turned a whole franchise around, which is, one of the things that people have to remember is that the Bulls were a failing organization, and nobody in Chicago really cared about him, and Michael Jordan was the guy who, because of his unbelievable talent and drive and athleticism and his charisma, was able to take that franchise to where it had never been before. And that's why, Michael Jordan was so perplexed and outraged that when there were these talks about we're going to dismantle this dynasty, he said, where were you guys before he got there? They had limited success as a team under Dick Motta with guys like Norm Van Leer and Jerry Sloan. I think they went to one conference finals back when they were in the West against the Lakers. But basically, Michael Jordan put that whole franchise on the map.
People forget the championship they won was their first, and then they just was a rite of passage that they were going to keep winning them, and it was all because of basically Jordan. But the whole Krause thing I find to be interesting because I'm 20 years old at the time, and at 20 years old at that time frame, I'm not paying attention to salary gripes and holdouts. It's just not top of mind. How big of a story was the Pippen contract back then?
Yeah, it was big. It was big. We all, when Scotty took that money right away, which was a bad deal, first of all, there weren't great contracts back then. But second of all, as the time went on and they're starting to win titles, then, that last season he's making, $2.78 million? Yeah. As the sixth highest paid player. Now, from the standpoint of the Bulls, that's a hell of a contract.
On his team.
On his team,
yes.
Sixth highest on his team, and he's obviously a top 10 player in the league, whatever. So, yes, he was grossly underpaid. Lots on him because he took that deal apparently over the objections of his agent, Jimmy Sexton. But that was a huge story. The Pippen thing, plus they brought in Kukoc for more money, and it was just one of these deals where he took a bad deal because he needed the money. But getting back to Jerry Krause, look, Jerry Krause, he found Scottie Pippen in nowhere, in little nowhere, central Arkansas. He gets, he drafts Horace Grant. Michael Jordan wanted another North Carolina player by the name of Joe Wolf. And everybody derided who was connected with Michael hated that draft pick. How'd that turn out for Horace Grant? And you can go on and on with the moves that Jerry Krause made until of course he brought in Tim Floyd. But during the leading up to the Bull run of the 90s, he just made great move after great move. And the organization, like Jerry Reinsdorf said, once you sign that contract, I don't want to hear from you. So Scotty did all this carping, but there was nothing he can do. And this whole notion, Mike, that Michael Jordan should have renegotiated. You don't renegotiate contracts in the NBAs with the players. First of all, Michael Jordan's not giving away money. He's not going to take less money like Tim Duncan took. And by the way, when Michael Jordan in his last couple of years in Chicago was making $30 and $33 million, which was unheard of, you know what? A lot of us in the media, we thought that was real fair for Michael Jordan because of what he'd done, where he took that organization from nothing into, as David Stern called it, one of the great sports teams in the world and one of the greatest dynasties of all time.
Yeah, and I know Mitch Lawrence is with us here, SiriusXM NBA radio, covered a lot of the NBA up close and personal throughout that time. I find how quickly Jordan went from the third pick to helping the Bulls. He misses the season. Can you imagine that happening now? Him going down to North Carolina, and I mean we've seen it with the Sixers here. We laugh about the Sixers can't even practice, normally, let alone go down to their college and have some one-on-one games. And then, hey, I want to come back and play. But that whole story I found to be fascinating about the minute restriction and there's 14 seconds left in the game and they won't let them play. I mean, that whole thing was bonkers.
And you know what? I sat there and watched it last night, and it's a long time ago for me. This is, 1985 for everybody. And I wasn't covering the team on a day-to-day basis at that point. I was still in Dallas, and I was starting to cover the Mavericks around 1986, 87. So I'm not that attuned to it. And you got to remember, this is before social media, too. Yeah. So there wasn't a lot of – there was some talk, obviously, because Jordan already had shown, wow, he's going to be something special, and for him to break his foot – people, everybody knew that. But this whole deal about what happened going back to Carolina, I don't think a lot of people outside of Chicago, unless you're a big-time plugged-in NBA person, if you're a casual fan like me last night, I'm sitting there going, wow, that's pretty amazing what happened. But I got to tell you, it's one thing. I'll pat myself on the back. When it was the beginning of part 2, and people are asking Scottie Pippen at a press conference about, what's going on with you don't want to like your contract. I'm one of those people who's asking a question. I'm sitting there, Mike, thinking, that sounds something like me, but I don't know. And then I got a couple of texts from some guys from old-time writers who said, hey, just heard you on The Last Dance. So, yeah, I was there. That proves it, right?
And I don't not believe that. I would. That's why I thought of you last night when I was watching it. This guy was probably right in the heat of a lot of this stuff that was happening during that time frame.
Let me tell you, before they got really big, and they got big when they got big in the late 90s. This is when Michael came back, and they had the great season where they were 72-10, and then 87-13 overall, which is the greatest season ever. That '96 season. When that was happening and things got really crazy, and they're the kind of the rock star team. Michael started to use off-duty Chicago policemen, off-duty cops, to be his security personnel. Nobody had done this before in terms of players.
Jeez.
He had, for the playoffs, when things got real nuts, he would have 6 guys. A security detail of 6 people. As I wrote for the Daily News back at the time, the New York Daily News. 4 were there to carry the litter, and 2 were there to scatter the rose petals. This was something we had never seen before. Now, earlier in the 90s, when he's first starting to win, he didn't have that. When he was starting to win, it was all new. It was exciting in Chicago. Chicago, the thing you remember, this is before the United Center. This is in the old place, the Chicago Stadium, which is still, to me, the loudest place I've ever been in, where you couldn't even hear when they did the public address, the famous public address thing, and Ray Clay was their PA announcer. By the time he was announcing Jordan, who was, of course, introduced last, you couldn't even hear his name. The place was so loud, the greatest acoustics ever. But anyway, it was just you just marveled at what happened in the 90s, because once the Bulls started to catch fire, winning that first three-peat, and then Jordan goes away and he comes back. By the end of the 90s, especially the 96, the season where they won the 72 games, this team is just like you'd never seen anything like it before in the NBA. I know people will say, well, the 86 Celtics are better, or they might have been, but I'm just telling you the way that Michael Jordan was revered as a rock star.
Yeah.
Was something different than Larry Bird and Magic Johnson. We had not seen that before. And he had, of course, broken through in terms of the sneakers and the marketing and stuff, which those guys kind of started Bird and Magic with their famous Converse ad, and then Jordan took it to a whole new level with Nike and everything.
I look forward to what's coming next. Rodman, I guess, is featured heavily in the next couple of ones here, but I'm really
the bad boys, right?
Yep,
Detroit.
I was really
there.
interested
I covered a lot. I'll tell you, I covered a lot of those playoffs, which were unbelievable when they beat up Michael Jordan, when Scottie Pippen got a migraine headache before Game 7, when the Bulls finally made their breakthrough. Those were legendary fistfights. Those were all-out wars back when the NBA playoffs were a lot of hand-to-hand combat, and they really did a number on Michael Jordan. The Bad Boys were a phenomenal team, as you know, and I can't wait to see those episodes because that should be really good.
Yeah, I was just going to say, the Bad Boy stuff, I was trying to explain last night how, before the Bulls, you had this group of Bad Boy guys, too, that they could get a 30 for 30 documentary on them because that's a whole nother story. Rodman was a part of that, and then the Bulls thing.
Yes.
So that's another. And by the way, the whole thing with Jordan and, obviously when he takes the break here, I'm going to be interested to see how they address that whole situation. I guess that could be something that makes some news.
Well, the thing about last night, and I saw this in other people's comments, there wasn't a lot of news there. I mean, I didn't follow the Bulls in the early 80s, but the fact that they were doing a lot of drugs, that's not surprising to me because that was part of the league. The thing that did surprise me a little bit, and it's a minor point, but I was wondering if other people picked up on it. They talk, of course, about Michael's big shot in the 82 finals against Georgetown, right, in the last 15 seconds. And they have Billy Packer, who was the great CBS announcer back then, who talked about how it was what happened at the end was amazing. Well, what he was really talking about was beyond Michael Jordan's last shot because Georgetown then had the ball, this phenomenal Georgetown team with Patrick Ewing, and a kid by the name of Freddie Brown was throwing a pass, and thought he was throwing it to one of his teammates, and he threw it right to James Worthy. And they didn't even talk about that play last night. After the Michael Jordan shot, I don't even think it was referenced. And I sat there stunned. It's one of the biggest blunders in American sports history. I'm not doing this to get on Freddie Brown. We all know what happened. They called it Freddie Brown's pass to renown. But that was the amazing, as Billy Packer says, there was an amazing thing at the end. That was the amazing thing because Georgetown still had plenty of time.
Yeah, it's like 9 seconds
to win
left.
that game. Michael made this shot with 15 seconds to go. And Georgetown had an unbelievable team, and they could have scored at the end until we saw. Now, this is the little cynic in me. I'm thinking if Freddie Brown turned and threw the ball to Michael Jordan, you think they might have shown that play last night and talked about it? Yeah, I think they did. It happened to go to James Worthy instead, so they didn't really talk about it.
I love the line from Worthy. I was better than him for about 2 weeks. That was fantastic.
Well, I'll tell you, the Carolina back then, and people criticized Dean Smith for holding down Michael Jordan, and a lot of that is true. Walter Davis, who was a tremendous scorer back in that era, often talk, they won't criticize Dean Smith, those guys, but there was a point where somebody asked Walter Davis, how is it that Dean Smith holds you down? Because Walter exploded in the league when he came in as a big-time scorer, and then, of course, Michael. And all he said was, sometimes you just got to let the horses run.
Mitch Lawrence, SiriusXM, NBA Radio. We'll have to catch up again on after these next couple of episodes here and get some more takes from you because it was really good stuff. I appreciate it, pal.
Hey, Mike, anytime. Enjoyed it. Thanks.
Yeah, man. Mitch Lawrence, like August appeared, via the Boardwalk Honda Hotline. We'll have to do like Mondays with Mitch throughout this documentary. He covered it all back then.